It's Gordon, which, when I heard it, I thought he said Gudrun. And you see, Gudrun, for those of you who don't know, Gudrun is who I dedicated my book to. Gudrun, right? For any Lawrence fans here, Gudrun is the name of my first pig. My first pig is called Gudrun. And she was a load of rubbish as well. And she was a load of rubbish manifested as a big lump of pork. Because, and this is a way of answering a question that I had no idea what I was going to say when I walked in through the doors, but people have been asking me questions over the last few minutes, and I'm going to seek in the next 20 minutes or so to answer some of those questions. And the first question was, how did I get into food waste? And the answer is Gudrun. Gudrun I bought when I was 15, she cost £90. And I borrowed a boar off my neighbouring farm and got her pregnant, and she started having piglets. And I very quickly realised that buying grain, buying food for my pigs in the market was not going to do what I originally intended, which is make some money out of these pigs. I was going to lose me money. This stuff is very expensive. It's unenvironmentally friendly. And so I thought, well, gosh, people wouldn't have reared pigs all these years if this is the result, just pouring money down the drain. And so I consulted traditional food production in pig units, and of course the way in which pigs have actually been used for 6,000 or 7,000 years by all human societies, with a few notable exceptions, is as food waste recycling units. So I went to my school canteen and I asked them to save all of the food that my school friends had turned their noses up at. And I went to the local baker, the local greengrocer, and the market. I went to the supermarket also, but they didn't want to talk to me back then. They didn't want to acknowledge that they were throwing away food. I went around the back and saw all the food in their bins. But I with a more amenable business in my area, I went around collecting all this food waste, feeding it to Gudrun and her offspring, and reared lots of piglets, which I slaughtered and then sold the pork to my school friends' parents, and made a decent amount of pocket money, and it was the most delicious pork I had before or since. So that whole thing, which started as a schoolboy's project, opened my eyes to the level of food waste that was coming out of our food supply chain at every single level. I didn't mention the farmer who used to give me all the potatoes, which we ate in our home, just because they were too big or too small or the wrong shape or size for the supermarkets, and he couldn't sell them, and so I used to barter potatoes for eggs. I had chickens as well, also fed on food waste, and that was another waste product. So there was waste on farms that I was seeing, waste at supermarkets, waste in the local bakery, waste in the greengrocers, and waste most notably in my school kitchens. And I was aware, I was an environmentalist since before I can remember, and I was aware that food production had a very big impact on the environment. And I just thought, well, this doesn't make sense. Surely there's something better we can be doing with this food than throwing it away. I was literally just scratching the surface. So, I started to, as one does, eat this food myself. And you have joined the waste of food eating fraternity if you weren't already part of it. I've heard from a couple of people in the audience that they've been rummaging in bins all their lives and finding in their... what kind of thing did your wife chuck in the bin? Or used to before you re-indoctrinated?
Best before
stuff past its best before date. Does anyone else want to confess to being opposed to best before date consumer? Anyone want to confess to not being a post to best before date consumer? Well, let's see if we can get a few. So there's a few people in this room who still, I'm not preaching to the converted, therefore, not 100%. And that is worrying. It's worrying. Best before, do you know what best before? Please tell me what best before is.
Just an indication that it will belong in that definition.
Correct definition. Correct definition.
May not.
Yes, it's the manufacturer's guarantee of quality. After that date, it's no longer definitely going to be at its typical top condition, but if it has a best before date on it, by definition it's safe to eat. Because if it was potentially dangerous, it could be used by people. That's the only one with food safety implications. Anything with a best before date is safe to eat after that date. You can pretty much tell, a banana is not going to hurt you after its best before date, unless it gets up and punches you in the face. It is not going to hurt you. So that's the best before date. So I started out on this exploration, an edible exploration of food waste in our society. It started with my pigs and sharing my pigs' breakfast, eating bread with them every morning. It was better bread than my father was buying from the supermarkets and bringing home. This was nice artisanal bread. I didn't have the idea back then, though I'm sure if I had, I would have done it, of turning all this bread into beer. As a 15-year-old, that would have been, literally the route to being, very popular amongst my friends. I have gone on, however, to make lots of cider. All my friends I grew up in Sussex, in Town Forest, if anyone knows it. And in our area, there are loads of people with individual apple trees or small orchards, and by and large, my volume has just risen. Could anyone at the back not hear me before? Could anyone not hear me? We don't need that. No. So I go around collecting all the apples from my neighbours, and we bring back all the apples. And in the farmyard, one weekend every year, we press all the apples. Everyone comes around, and we make lots of pasteurised apple juice. Old technology of just putting it in the bottle and then cooking it in the bottle, and loads of cider, about 1,000 litres of cider every year rather. And, what's the unit of production in the beer? What's the volume of beer production coming out of stale bread? Yeah. How much beer are you making?
Brewing 20,000 bottles.
20,000 bottles per.
Over the last 3 months.
Amazing. 20,000 bottles of beer made out of stuff that would have been wasted. That is the kind of delicious, nutritious opportunity that there is out there. We are wasting, as I later went on to discover when I eventually turned my hobby of unofficial bin inspections into this 300-something page book. And I did a calculation that showed that at least a third of the world's food supply between the plough and the plate was being wasted, at least in the rich countries, much more. So, that individual practice, which became a campaign, I was taking journalists around the back of supermarkets and showing how much food was being wasted and pointing out that there were charities just down the road who would have taken it and fed hundreds of hungry people with it. That campaign got embedded within this book, with lots of research. And then in 2009, when that was published, and I knew that I'd written a book that only a handful of people in the world were actually going to read, I had to take this message in a more digestible form to a larger number of people. So I thought, the best way of doing that is multiply what I've already been doing, but by a few times. So I organised the first, many Feeding the 5,000 events, where we fed 5,000 people in Trafalgar Square, all with a load of rubbish, all with food that otherwise would have been wasted, like the wonky carrots and bent bananas and all of this food that supermarkets reject because it doesn't comply with their cosmetic standards. And we fed 5,000 people. I had absolutely no idea how to cook for 5,000 people. We didn't even have a cooking plan until about 10 days before the event, when we found somebody who happened to own the biggest pots in Europe. And they literally this big. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll carry for 5,000 people, just send over the volunteers and food and we'll do it. And then I had absolutely no idea if anyone was going to come and eat my load of rubbish. And it was a snowy day in December in Trafalgar Square. And I remember that moment at 12:20ish, and I'd just been talking to some news programme about what I was about to do without a clue that I was actually about to do it. And I looked over the balcony and there was this huge queue of people all the way around Trafalgar Square. And that was when I realised that actually this was going to be a global movement. And sure enough, it has kicked off in a very big way. It has been an amazing roller coaster to go from when I started campaigning on this issue to now. Back then, none of the supermarkets, none of the big food companies, no governments, had policies to tackle food waste. The level of awareness of the size, the scale, the significance of food waste in the general public was virtually nothing. And now it is a global priority recognised by the United Nations, the World Bank, even the IMF, the European Commission. Every member state in the European Union has some food waste reducing policies, some more, some less. There isn't a single big company that hasn't got something in its CSR report about what it's doing to tackle food waste. The level of awareness on consumers is incomparably greater, and indeed there has even been some improvement in behaviour. In the United Kingdom, since 2007, food waste in people's homes alone has been reduced by 21%. So when you try and look for environmental campaigns that have resulted in concrete behaviour change with the effect of reducing an environmental problem, they're very hard to find, and this is one of the most successful environmental campaigns in the world, and what has been achieved in the United Kingdom is now recognised, and people are around the world wanting to replicate it. So I'm actually not looking for applause, because you have been slightly put on the spot to rate yourself by your food waste awareness or your food waste practices. Everyone is looking at your plate to see whether you've finished every last morsel. And I would forgive you for feeling like you've been brought here to be judged. Well, I want to turn that around. I kind of feel like it is I that need to be judged. And I need to be judged because I picked an easy topic, one that no one can really disagree with, that it's almost suspiciously too easy for the big food corporations to make themselves look better in the public eye by doing something that doesn't actually cost them anything, that doesn't necessarily mean they're fundamentally changing the way in which they're currently producing and sourcing food. We're still chopping down rainforests at an accelerating rate. We are in the middle of a mass extinction event, which is primarily being driven by food production. There are still 1 billion people who are hungry in the world, and a couple of billion who are overfed. Have I made it too easy for the international institutions and for the corporations who are providing us our food by focusing on food waste, almost a way of letting them off the hook in addressing other fundamental problems? My objective in picking on food waste is evident injustices, it's evident stupidity, it's evident criminality in the face of hunger on the same street that we're filling bins with food. My intention was actually encapsulated in this quote, which I'm going to bore you with, by Zizek, not an author, Zizek, who I don't read very often, but he wrote an essay, and I thought this really chimed with what I set out to do. He wrote, "To demand consistency at strategically selected points where the system cannot afford to be consistent is to put pressure on the entire system. The art of politics lies in making particular demand, in my case food waste reduction, which, while thoroughly realistic, strike at the core of hegemonic ideology and imply a much more radical change. A political movement begins with an idea, something to strive for, but once people get deeply engaged in it, they become aware that much more than meeting their initial demand would be needed to bring about true justice." My intention with food waste was to put pressure in exactly that way on a system that destroys the earth, that in fact, whilst apparently providing infinite abundance for us in wealthy countries, in fact is laying the foundations for a future in which our soils are not sufficiently fertile, not sufficiently replenished to feed future generations, a world in which all the other species die at the hands of our agricultural extension into their habitat, a world in which, as I've said, 1 billion people are hungry. My intention by focusing on food waste was to lay bare the contradictions, to put pressure on that system. Now, when I look at the situation and I see the messages being absorbed by some of my chief adversaries, I think, how do I take this back? Have I actually just played into their hands and become a pawn in the capitalist, consumerist economy that we're all bought into? How do I retake the territory that is being swallowed up? Do you mind if I have another read? Because I wrote, as I said, including those 450 pages of text on this, and then I came across this passage. Anyone a reader of John Locke, the 17th century English philosopher? Great philosopher, not usually wheeled out as an advocate of food waste reduction. But here he is. He's writing in the Second Treatise of Government, which was published in 1690, written a few years before that. He's writing in the context of the process of enclosure. Enclosure, for anyone not familiar with the history of land ownership, is that process which started in the 16th century, spearheaded by my own country, the United Kingdom, not the UK back then, England. And that was the process of making land, which had previously been largely a common good, it was part of the commons, peasants could use it. There were rules, there were manorial kind of rights over land, but it was not actually owned by private ownership in the same way that I own this pencil. And the Enclosure Acts gradually, future landowners applied for the right to enclose land and to possess it. And their justification, amongst others, was that if you give private ownership of land to individuals, they have an incentive to increase production. They will profit from that increased production, but in profiting from increasing that production, they will deliver a public good, namely increased food supplies for a burgeoning human population. That was the underlying ideological premise for land ownership. And John Locke said, well, fine, but that does lay upon your shoulders certain responsibilities. He summarises them here. It's going to take a couple of minutes. He says, but if they, i.e. the crops that you've grown, if they perished in his possession, in possession of the landowner, if they perished in his possession without their due use, if the fruits rotted or the venison putrefied before he could spend it, he offended against the common law of nature and was liable to be punished. If either the grass of his enclosure rotted on the ground, or the fruit of his planting perished without gathering and laying up, this part of the earth, notwithstanding his enclosure, was still to be looked on as waste, and might be the possession of any other person. He was only to look that he used them before they spoiled, else he took more than his share and robbed others. And indeed it was a foolish thing, as well as dishonest, to hoard up more than he could make use of. If he gave away part to anybody else, so that it perished not uselessly in his possession, these he also made use of. And if he also bartered away plums that would have rotted in a week for nuts that would last good for his eating a whole year, he did no injury. He wasted not the common stock, destroying no part of the portion of goods that belonged to others, so long as nothing perished uselessly in his hands. The exceeding of his bounds of his just property not lying in the largeness of his possession, but the perishing of anything uselessly in it. When I go and look in supermarket bins and I see the food there, not just being wasted but actually being locked, when I see, has anyone come across the man who's famous in Belgium called the Muffin Man? He is a hero, like the food waste pantheon. The Muffin Man, I first met him here in Brussels some years ago now. He had been arrested for taking... They were claiming that he had broken the law, that he was a thief, because that wasted food was actually still technically the property of the supermarket. He showed me on his clothes burn marks, and on his back holes where the bleach that the supermarket had poured onto this food to prevent him from taking it had burnt a hole in his clothes. As I observed to him then, the legality of taking food waste out of a bin has not yet been tested in court. The legality of attempting to murder somebody is quite clear. And that is effectively what happened. He was eventually acquitted. And indeed, I was invited by the Belgian government to hold a conference here on food waste some years ago. It was the beginning of what eventually became Feeding the 5,000 Brussels. And there he was. The ministers were queuing up to take their photograph with him as a hero against food waste. So, in a society that wastes food, that proactively tries to prevent people who need that food from reclaiming that food, how can we judge that society according to Locke's principles? Locke's principles that essentially, by wasting food, we not only lose the right to the ownership of that food, but we lose the right to the land on which it was grown. There's another guy who put a similar idea into the mouths of a monkey. Anyone listen to Dave Bartholomew or Pelkin, New Orleans musicians from the 1950s? This is the monkey, and it's called The Monkey Speaks His Mind. He's defending monkeys against the accusation that humans are descended from monkeys. That man descended from our noble race, the very idea is a big disgrace. You'll never see a monkey build a fence around a coconut tree and let all the coconuts go to waste, forbidding all other monkeys to come and taste. Why? If I put a fence around this tree, starvation will force you to steal from me. So, food waste and its message is being proactively co-opted. Even the packaging industry, those demons of the environmental world, are now claiming that they are the heroes because their packaging prevents food from being damaged and therefore reduces food waste. Let's have more packaging. When I see that, and I think of why I got into food waste in the first place, to be a radical challenge to that system, I'm constantly thinking, how can I retake this territory? How can I throw this back in their face? Well, one of the reasons why I'm most excited about a particular line of action that my organisation is doing at the moment is precisely because I think it helps us do this. Earlier today, a few people in the room were at a policy workshop organised to brilliant effect by Full Circle with the Fair Trade Advocacy Group. I think we still have Peter in the room. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the work at some point. And essentially the work that we've been doing is going overseas in our supply chains where European supermarkets are sourcing all those things that we used to only buy when they're in season in Europe, and now we expect green beans and mange tout, not just in the summer when they grow here, but all year round. Of course, that means going to Kenya, where those products do grow year round. Fine, well, you might say, why are we getting non-seasonal products? But if you, whether or not you accept that this is a legitimate way of sourcing food, we can all surely accept that in a country with millions of hungry people, where land and water are very scarce resources, it surely doesn't make sense to waste food on the scale that we do in European countries. But sure enough, when I was invited out there first by the United Nations Environment Programme to feed a gala dinner of environment ministers and other UN delegates with food waste sourced in Kenya, and we managed to put on a three-course meal, delicious three-course meal, made entirely out of waste that we had sourced in Kenyan supply chains. And we found that most of that waste that we were looking at was being caused by the policies of European supermarkets, in particular the cosmetic standards that say beans have to be exactly 9 centimetres long to fit into our stupid plastic packaging, so farmers are trimming off a third of the bean just to get them in to this crate. That European supermarkets would give a forecast of 100 tonnes of beans every week during the summer, come the day before, sometimes the day, even sometimes the day after the food was loaded into an aeroplane, to be flown out to Europe after the farmer has invested time, money, chemicals, labour, land, water into growing that food, then the order would be cancelled and the farmer and the exporter would not be paid. That kind of criminal activity, which essentially is a transfer of risk in the European market, we can't predict demand, who bears the risk? At the moment it is being borne by Kenyan farmers who are farming just a couple of acres near Mount Kenya. It's borne by their day labourers who we filmed and interviewed and who explained that when they destroy a crop because an order has been cancelled, they only get paid half wages. These are people on less than $2 a day who explain that when this happens, they potentially lose their homes because they're renting homes. They can't send their kids to school and sometimes they can't put food on their plates. I don't know a single European consumer who is happy that that is what is happening in our food supply chain. So, by Locke's rationale, by Dave Bartholomew's rationale, these Kenyan farmers, they have a right to come and steal our food. They can't have a right to take what we think is ours of us. So, we were discussing in this workshop the potential introduction of policies to remove unfair trading practices within the European market. And there's some reasonable chance that we might actually succeed. But will it be enough? And what role do we have? And what role do I have? And am I living up to that role? Or am I just playing into the hands of the food corporations? I stand to be judged by you.
About the beans. Do we buy the beans because it's income for those small farmers? Or do we not buy the beans because of the things you just said?
It's a very good question. So, obviously, there are very legitimate arguments to say that we should be doing local, seasonal food production and not going miles and miles away to buy food that we don't even need. And you can very legitimately buy food according to that principle without conceiving it as a boycott of overseas products, just because that's the food that you want to eat, and that's the food system that you want to pay for. And no one can fault you for choosing local seasonal products. The keenest advocates I have ever met of importing food from Kenya to Europe are the Kenyan farmers, who, in addition, obviously, to providing food for their own country, manage to make a bit of cash this way. So you can prioritise their very understandable wish to build themselves out of poverty, to have some of the comforts that we all enjoy, and production of food and export to Europe is one of the ways in which they do that. But what I think we can all accept is, as I said, that if we're going to do it, we do it without getting them to waste 40% of the food they're growing as they do at present. So how do we do that? Well, unfair trading practices regulations and telling whoever your political representatives that that's what you want to see in Europe is one way of doing it. Directly telling supermarkets that that is what you want to see is another way of doing it. Joining and signing up to organisations like my own, like Peter's, is another way of doing it. If you want to get your hands dirty and go a step beyond just voicing your concern at the point of purchase, which is, I think, at the very least what we are responsible if we're paying for something to be done, we want it to be done in accordance with our own principles. Can I have a show of hands? Am I talking nonsense? Hands up, who thinks that supermarket policy is causing farmers in Kenya to not be paid and to waste nearly half of their products is okay? Hands up who thinks it's definitely not okay. Hands up who thinks it's just the way things are and we can't do anything about it. Some people belong in a category that I haven't stated. I'd like to know what those are. Who belongs in the category that I haven't stated and what is it? Is anyone willing to put it forward?
Who buys the beans?
Who buys the beans? What do you mean?
Well, you buy the beans.
Do I?
No, not you, but
Oh, who buys
do
beans
we
from
buy
Kenya?
those beans that cause the waste?
At the moment, if you buy beans from Kenya, you do, probably. But, as a response, so we actually got some of these Kenyan beans at our Feeding the 5,000 event here in Brussels. We made a lot of noise about it. And there has been a response from the industry. They've got together, they've come to 11-11-11, who was our partner organisation, who we actually went back to Kenya with, made a filming, campaign video, and about the cosmetic standards and about the order cancellations. And they've come to the table and said, okay, we're going to reform this supply chain. And one of the things that is now available in stores in Belgium, as I understand it, same as what we already achieved in the UK, is getting the policy of the supermarkets to change on a company-by-company basis, and you can now buy beans that have not been trimmed. So whole beans, or at least beans, so this is a bit of a geeky thing, but we convinced the UK supermarkets to stop the practice of topping and tailing, chopping the top and the tail, and only chop the top off. So we think we got halfway. And it may sound a little bit silly, but we went and met some of the exporters who are producing for this supply chain in December last year, and they told us that that single measure, which through proactive campaigning, we convinced the supermarkets to adopt pretty much overnight, a few months, which is overnight for supermarket standards, had reduced her waste by 30%. Just that one measure, and I calculated that that was saving 70,000 euros of beans from this single grower or exporter every year, transposed onto the whole of the Kenyan market of just green beans to the EU, adopting that single halfway post of policy change would save the equivalent of 0.03% of the Kenyan economy. So buying whole dollars or only topped beans would be a fairly easy step to go, and one that probably should consider ourselves under obligations to adopt.
I see we've got other people indicating now to ask questions, but actually now I'd like to give people a break. We'll need some other people afterwards, but also invite you to come back and for the rest of the buffet, and then
Can I just check one thing? Because I was about to say that getting your hands dirty is that sentence. If you want to get your hands dirty, you can go and harvest some of this stuff that would otherwise be wasted. One of the great products of the Feed the 5,000 campaign that we launched in April last year was the creation of the Gleaning Network Belgium. This is part of an initiative that my organisation launched in the UK and is now being championed by Helena, who hopefully will have a little moment to tell us about going and picking cabbages next week and how that is part of the food waste revolution.
thank you very much. So.